you know, true by the letter here, but I think it'll help in understanding what's going on with this. I think of our metabolism in our body like an engine. Engines take in fuel, they burn them, there's a lot of breakdown products from that, but it releases a ton of energy, and that's what runs the motor, right? But the problem is those breakdown products are kind of grungy, they build up, they gum up the works, and they make the engine less efficient. So you gotta eventually clean this stuff out, or your engine's gonna seize up. And in our body, we do the same thing. At the level of our mitochondria, there's little engines that are burning. We're burning carbohydrates and fats and proteins for energy, just like this thing's burning dinosaur fuel. But we're making metabolic byproducts that are also gunking up the works. And one of those metabolic byproducts in our body is acids. We make acids, and not this kind of late 60s low bad trip acids, but the acids that you learned about in chemistry. And there's a whole slew of them, and you don't have to know any of this junk. The important thing to know is that there's two big classes of acids that build up in our body that we've got to deal with. One of them is CO2. You remember way back in basic biology, they would talk about aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. And aerobic was the good one. You use oxygen, and that was cool because you got to use the Krebs cycle, and you broke your fuel, your sugars, your glucose, all the way down into CO2 and water. Water's great. I don't mind having water around in my body. And CO2 is not so bad, right? It's pretty easy to get rid of CO2. So that's one of the good but more common acids that builds up in our system all the time. While I'm sitting here talking and breathing, I'm building up CO2. I've got to get rid of it. I'm breathing it out. There's a lot of other, I'm going to call them bad acids that build up. They're not really bad, but when you go into anaerobic metabolism, you're working real hard and that Krebs cycle isn't working. Remember them talking about building up things like a lot of lactic acid or lactate. And if you've had Fahim here talking, you know that lactate buildup is the sign of your body's not metabolizing well. There's something going on wrong with it. When we break down fats, like when you go into DKA, you build up a lot of ketones, and those are acids that monkey with your system. You build up, you break down proteins, or if you're in renal failure, so you can't get rid of all the extra proteins in the BUN, that builds up. And those are all acids that build up in your system. And these are a little bit tougher to get rid of. But we got to get rid of these acids somehow. Turns out CO2 is a piece of cake. CO2 dissolves in water and forms carbonic acid, travels around, comes out to the lungs, turns back into CO2. That's all I got to do to get rid of CO2. Piece of cake. As long as I can still breathe, I can get rid of CO2. It's volatile. It's gaseous. We just breathe it away. The other acids, all those other, the lactate and ketones and stuff like that, are a little tougher to deal with. So what we do, we have a system in our body where you've got bicarbonate, which is a base. It matches up with that acid, neutralizes it, carries it over to the kidney, and you get to pee it away and get rid of it. It's a little bit more of a complicated process than just breathing, because you got to have kidneys that work, and you got to have perfusion that gets it there. But it's really this bicarb stuff that is neutralizing and dealing with all the other acids that we don't want hanging around in our body. So what do we mean when we say our bicarb is low? You know, you see people and they're over in recess and they're really profoundly acidotic because their bicarb's low. DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, and they've got a really low bicarb. Is the bicarb really low? Did we get rid of it? Did it go away? No, it's just busy. We've just got the bicarb tied up, binding other acids, neutralizing it. So you got to remember that bicarb is actually kind of a base. It's just the opposite of an acid, but it's really important for our acid-base balance. That making sense so far? Couple of definitions that we got to be savvy with here. The term emia just means this is what's going on in your blood. If you've got hyperkalemia, what do you got? Too much potassium in the blood. Hypoglycemia, too little potassium, too little glucose in the blood. So when we say acidemia, what we mean is there's too much acid. The blood is actually acidic, so it's got a low pH to it. Or if we say alkalemia, there's too much base. Same thing as not enough acid. It's higher pH. So neutral pH in our body is about 7.4. If you're lower than that, you're acidemic. Conditions called osis are just things that are pushing you that direction. They don't necessarily mean that you're already there. So you can have, like, fibrosis means you're building up fibrosis in your body. You may not be all scarred up yet, tuberculosis. You're building up the little tubercles from when you get the infection, but you're not necessarily all the way there. So an acidosis is a condition that's pushing you towards being acidic and acidemic, but it may not have pushed you all the way there yet. An alkalosis is something that's pushing you towards being alkalotic, but it may not have pushed you all the way there yet. And the reason that's important is because, well, actually, let me come back to that in a second. Let's go back to the acids. We talked about CO2 as being truly an acid. Carbon dioxide dissolved in liquid is an acid. Think about what Coke does to a penny when you stick it in there. You know CO2 is dissolved in Coke, right? So if you've got too much CO2, that's a respiratory acidosis. CO2 is your respiratory acid, the one you breathe. Think of too much CO2 as a respiratory acidosis, and it's something that's pushing you towards being acidic in your bloodstream. Conversely, if you've got too little CO2, it's going to be a respiratory alkalosis. That makes sense, right? Now the bicarb side of this stuff, remember bicarb is actually a base. So if you've got too little of a base, that's the same thing as an acidosis, right? Pushing you towards being acidic. And if you've got too much of a base, that's pushing you towards being alkalotic. That's an alkalosis. And the reason it's important to know the difference between the emia and the osis is because you can have mixes of the oses that'll land you in a different emia. So if I have a respiratory acidosis and I have a metabolic acidosis, what do you think my blood pH is going to be? It's going to be acid, right? I got two things pushing me in the direction of acid. So I've got an acidemia. If I've got two alkaloses going on, they'll push me towards the alkalotic side, and I'll get alkalemia. But what if you have the two of them balanced? Respiratory acidosis. Too much CO2, that's the respiratory acidosis. And too much bicarb, it's a metabolic alkalosis. They can balance each other out, and my emia may be normal. I got a little bit too much of the respiratory acidosis, I may be acidemic. If I've got a little bit too much of the alkalosis, I may get alkalemic. So the emia is what your pH is telling you. That's what your blood really is. And the oses are the conditions that are pushing you there. Hopefully this will make sense why that's important in just a minute. All right. So why is it bad to have a pH that's out of whack?
Choose your protein.
Yeah, it does all kinds of things. You remember that crazy chemistry professor who would always say things like, we're going to do this reaction in SN2 nuclear formation is going to happen in a pH and temperature dependent fashion, and it'll form this, that, and the other thing. And everybody blew off that in a pH and temperature dependent fashion when they were drawing those arrows. But what he meant was, if your pH is out of whack or your temperature is out of whack, that reaction won't happen. And we got a whole slew of reactions in our body that need to run well for us to function. For example, the Krebs cycle has to work for us to make ATP and get energy. Our neurotransmitters have to bind to the receptors in our brain, and that chemical reaction happens in a temperature and pH dependent fashion. So if your neurotransmitters aren't binding to the receptors in your brain, you're going to get altered mental status and motor dysfunction and seizures and all kinds of stuff like that. This is the big one. What if your catecholamines, what if your epinephrine, what if your norepinephrine doesn't bind to the receptors in your body? It's not going to stimulate your heart to beat. It's not going to stimulate your blood vessels to constrict. And what we're going to wind up is what we always see in the crashing patient. You know, this is the rhythm that you see right at the end when everybody's falling apart. And what's happening is their pH has gotten low. They're acidic. Their epinephrine doesn't bind to their catecholamine receptors anymore, and they go into this cardiovascular collapse. So it's really important for us to not let people get a real low pH like this, because that's the final, very often, the final step before somebody goes into death. Fortunately, these two processes kind of compensate for each other. They balance each other out. If I've got too much of a respiratory acid, too much CO2 in my body, building up, making me acidic, what do I do to balance that? How do I compensate for that?
Get more bicarb.
Yeah, exactly. I get more bicarb, and I use that to bind up other acids so that it balances. If I've got too little bicarb, if I've got all my bicarbs busy and I'm acidic, I blow off that extra CO2 to bring my pH back to a normal level so that I'm not too far out of balance.
Doesn't that take a while, so the bicarb to
for it to come up though?
It
I'll
does, we're
listen
gonna
to
come
it.
back to that in a
Okay.
second, you're absolutely right. The respiratory compensation, if I need to breathe fast, I can do that right there, I can do that on the spot. If I need my kidneys to work fast and process bicarb, that takes a little while longer for it to happen. But the cool thing is these two things balance each other out in very predictable patterns, and it's not hard to do just a tiny bit of simple math with the information you get off of a blood gas to figure out what's going on. It allows us to diagnose what's going on, figure out what's wrong with the patient. That helps us figure out how to fix them, and more importantly, it helps us predict when they're gonna crash so that we can avoid that. The whole idea behind these blood gas things is they're gonna give you information, but the information in isolation doesn't help you. You've already gotta have a pretty good idea what's going on with this clinical patient. And then you're gonna get your blood gas to confirm it. It's gonna answer a specific clinical question for you. All right, so enough of that theoretical hooey. This is what a gas looks like when it comes to us, right? There's a whole bunch of other numbers down here, but I put a picture over that because I really don't care. A lot of that stuff, you can let Drs. Leos and those guys up in ICU take care of that. All we really need to know for our blood gas analysis to get most of our information is what's the pH, what's the CO2 doing, and what's the bicarb doing. We used to get blood gases all the time for oxygen levels, but you never see people do that anymore because we've got those pulse oximeters that work so well, right? I would take that oxygen one out of it. All right, so there's only a few things that can happen with your pH, right? It can only be too high or too low. It's not too intimidating. Your CO2 can only be too high or too low. Your bicarb can only be too high or too low, right? And you can plug those three things into a formula and figure out what's going on with your patient. There's only 3 steps that you've got to remember to go through when you're looking at a blood gas to interpret it. One is, what's the pH doing? Is it too high or too low? If it's too high, it's greater than 7.4, what are you going to call that? Yeah, exactly. That's alkalemia. And if it's less than 7.4, that's acidemia. The next thing you want to know is, what's the primary acid-base disorder? And by that we mean, is this being pushed more by a respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, or is it being pushed more by a metabolic acidosis or alkalosis? So how can you tell that?
From the number, the CO2 number,
Yeah, exactly. You just look at,
and your bicarb number?
you know, your respiratory one is going to be based on your CO2. So look at that and ask yourself, is it too high or too low? Is it an acidosis or an alkalosis? So if your CO2 is too high, too much CO2, too much acid, that's an acidosis. And if your pH is acidic, it's probably your CO2 that's your primary cause. It's a primary respiratory acidosis. If your bicarb is the one that's more out of whack, and it's out of whack in the same direction as your EMEA, your blood pH, then it's probably
Metabolic.
a metabolic problem. And then what you can do to reality check yourself is come back and ask, is the compensation appropriate? So if I think it's a metabolic one, then I know I would compensate by changing my breathing. I can go back and see if I change my breathing the right amount. Or if I know the primary problem is breathing related, then I know that my kidneys should compensate in a way. I can go back and check and see if the kidneys have compensated appropriately. And if they do, then I know I'm right on track. If they don't, then I know something funky's going on with the patient. All right, let's run. Probably the best way to do that. I'm going to skip through this part memorization-wise, but I just want to hit it conceptually. There's 2 formulas that will allow you to predict your compensation. We'll come back to that in a second. I'm not going to ask you guys to memorize that stuff. It's on Google. I don't think you need to. Let's walk through a couple of examples here, just using those 3 steps, and I think this will make a little bit more sense. So you got this patient here. Let's analyze that. Let's go through the 3 steps. So step 1, what's the pH doing?
Acid.
Okay, exactly. So she's got an acidemia. A-C-I-D-E-M-I-A. What's the primary disorder there?
Yeah, the bicarb.
Well, we know, actually, this is pH,
CO2.
that's
CO2.
CO2 right there.
And bicarb.
And actually, I'm sorry, that's,
That's your
okay, there's
oxygen,
bicarb right there.
That's your PO2, 90.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha, you're right. So she's got an acidosis. The respiratory respiratory is too low. CO2 is too low. That's an alkalosis, right? So that can't be the primary problem.
Right.
So it's probably metabolic acidosis. So we're gonna say metabolic acidosis. And 3, we're gonna ask about the compensation. Yeah, it's going the direction you'd expect it to. Has it gone far enough?
No.
That's where we go back to these formulas here. You would expect your CO2 to go up based on this formula here. So if your bicarb is 10, so 10 times 1.5, that's going to be 15 plus 8 plus or minus 2. Your bicarb should be at about 23 or so.
25. Oh, 22.
I mean, CO2 should be about 23, and it is at about 23. So it does seem like that's appropriately compensated. So you've got a metabolic acidosis, and the patient is breathing appropriately to take care of that. All right, let's go through some real cases here, because these principles will make more sense, I think, when you've got a clinical correlation with them. 35-year-old female. She's got a history of depression. She's found unresponsive next to an empty bottle of Lortab. And this is her gas. Let me get something to reset. Okay, I heard respiratory acidosis already. She's definitely
Not breathing much.
acidemia, right?
Right.
Yeah, respiratory.
So she's got too much acid. The primary problem, her CO2 is way up. That's a respiratory acidosis. That would explain it. Bicarb is actually kind of normal. That's not going to explain it. So she's probably got a pure respiratory acidosis. What do you think's going on with her? Yeah, that's as simple as can be. The bicarb hasn't had time to compensate because, oops, we lost it here. She just shot up a little while ago. Her kidneys haven't had time to catch up with it.